Sophomore wide receivers about to reach superstardom. Who is on the list that you must draft in 2025? That's what we're going to talk about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined by Rich Hribar of Sharp Football Analysis. Rich, you did touch on it at the end of the last show when we talked about quarterbacks, about your pre-draft write-ups team by team. I have been checking those out. So detailed, lots of information in those. Anything else as we kick this show off today that you want to let the listeners know about, check out before? We're itching so close to that NFL draft. It's not far away now.
Yeah, we started just with the rookies and the rookie draft emphasis stuff, but we've already rolled out the draft kit that I put out every year, and it's like a living, breathing draft kit. So by the time you get to August, I'll have over 100 articles put in this thing. So definitely check that out if you're interested in my work for like the rest of the summer and the full season. Everything I basically do gets put into that all summer.
Awesome. I highly recommend it. There's going to be nuggets in there that you're not going to find elsewhere with the amount of depth that Rich is putting into those. We did talk about quarterbacks earlier this week. We are going to dive in now to the wide receiver positions. But if you didn't check that one out, I would recommend checking it out after looking at some of the rushing profiles of the second and third year players and who you should be drafting. We're going to do a similar kind of aspect here as we look at the rookie wide receiver class from last year and kind of have a 12-month view of it and what that means going forward. These players, we often see the biggest jump in their career, either as they obviously enter the league because they haven't done anything, but that second to third year jump as well. I think looking just at a broad view of it first is when we look back to this time last year, we thought we had a pretty impressive class that there was enough to be excited about. Then a lot of them obviously went in round one. There was some of those ones that went in round one that felt a little bit questionable towards the back end of the draft. We had a couple that we'll talk about today that went early in round two. But looking back at like even with the some of the disappointments of, let's say, Odunze, Marvin Harrison not hitting what people would have hoped, this class has kind of stocked up the wide receiver position, I think, for a number of years to come. There's a couple of these guys and Nabors and Thomas already in those opening two rounds of drafts. I think we're looking at this, I think, with a pretty good, not rose-tinted glasses, but 1 year in, this is a pretty impressive class.
And we've been spoiled with some good rookie wide receiver performances. In probably the last decade, which has changed. It used to be like you have to wait for guys, right? Remember, there used to always be like when we were younger, it'd be like year three wide receivers, right? But
year three, let's go.
Yeah, and I do a yearly thing that's part of that draft kit where I look at like ADP trends and like where things we can beat the market in, and literally there's been nothing more valuable than year one, year two wide receivers in fantasy football. And you get why that is, because fantasy football and fantasy football analysis is guilty of this, and sometimes I'm guilty of this too. So I definitely don't want to say like I'm better than anyone in this regard, but a lot of times at fantasy football, gamers won't pay for anything unless they've seen it, right? Like, so
I've been talking about this a lot in the last couple of people want to open the box and see what they have. Like they want to know, like but the problem is like we just talked on the last show about Jaden Daniels. We're going to talk here about Brian Thomas Jr. in a minute. Like when it's out of the box, it's in the second round. Like let's get it when it's in the double-digit rounds or in round.
But you can also use that to your advantage too. And you brought up some of the names that disappointed as rookies too. It wasn't just like the guys that hit, like Ladd and Brian Thomas, who then, because they hit now, people are like, hey, we've seen it, we know where the upside results, and that gets priced in. But then you have a thing like JSN last year, who was a disappointing rookie pick at his ADP, gets depressed last year in year two. And granted, like he took off after the DK Metcalf midseason injury, and then they never were able to put that kind of back in the bottle. And he was good the rest of the year and was one of the better values at ADP. So there are still ways to still use this to your advantage, even though like some of the guys ended up popping. And like you said, you got to peek into the Christmas present.
Yeah, and it is a case of like, what do people believe is real, and what, like, again, we talked a little bit with Bryce Young being an example. Like, was year one real? Was year two real? Which is the real player? And again, we see players like, let's say, Xavier Worthy. We'll talk about him in a moment, but we had a lot of plays last year. You could put a highlight clip or a low light clip of like plays where him and Mahomes just didn't connect and they were off by, let's say, 5 yards. And if he catches a couple of those, he's back into, like, he's up in that tier. We're looking at Brian Thomas Jr. for adding those touchdowns. We look at then he has a Super Bowl where he has 2 touchdowns and goes off, but people might be not fully buying into that. So his ADP isn't really necessarily going to reflect it. But I think that that's the thing in year 1 and year 2. I mentioned Keenan Allen, but like Devontae Adams, like look back to the way his career started. People were all out at this point. So that's where we're going to do this. You're going to tell me which of these guys that stunk up the joint last year. We're not going to get as far as Jalen Polk on this show because it's over. But all joking aside, like there is some of these names will be like, oh yeah, that like. They went in the first round last year, but they didn't deliver, so they should just be kind of off the board this year. That's not the case. And again, JSN, although I think like for RotoViz listeners last year, we were probably like too in love with JSN even after a bad rookie season. We drafted a whole lot of them, so it worked out pretty well in the end up. But we're going to start off here with Brian Thomas, and it's based on where they're going and what our expectations are. How next level can these players go? Can they be somebody who ends up like let's say Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, or are they somebody who's going to be kind of a wide receiver too, and so on? So their priority targets at ADP would take 10 picks after ADP, fade or off the board. I'm going to try and push you on some off the board players maybe today.
Right.
We did, but Brian Thomas Jr. had a season where there was multiple quarterbacks involved with it, but down the stretch, absolutely broke out, but is now going as wide receiver 6, pick 10 by FFPC Best Ball Tournament ADP. So he's right up there with those elite guys. But again, to highlight how good of a start it has been, both him and Nabors as wide receiver 4, just from that class is phenomenal. We're looking at the Jaguars. Like the Jaguars are not an organization that have been known for doing things, the right direction all the time. But wide receiver 8 here ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown. Is that the right spot here as we enter year 2?
I mean, it's right on that cusp, right? Like he's definitely capable of getting there. And, I think more from like, a dynasty stance, like we're just fully believing in Brian Thomas Jr. from a redraft stance. It's definitely a rich price. But when you look at the only rookies to have more yards per out run than him on over 300 routes, since 2010 are Odell Beckham, AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, and Jamar Chase. Like that's a pretty good list. The dudes.
It's pretty good.
He's also a great lesson too, as we approach the draft, that just because a player didn't do something in college doesn't mean he's incapable of doing it in the pros. He was roadblocked at LSU by Malik Nabors. And in terms of getting a lot of the free squares in the offense. We talked about the free square stuff with Drake London, right? Like in the other podcast. And
LSU might have had some good wide receivers.
They just might have. And it's a great lesson to remind you of some of these ex receivers like coming into this class. Like if you look at like a guy like Jaden Higgins, right? Like he didn't get access to a lot of those routes in college because they had Jalen Noel running those routes.
Yeah.
So like LSU had Malik Nabors getting the slot fades and working a lot more out of the slot. And as a byproduct, Brian Thomas Jr. was like, a lot of people like sometimes in the eval with him was like, well, is he just going to be an X wide receiver? And where he really was able to take off from a fantasy stance is when he was able to get that full field usage. So fantasy football has changed since we've been playing. And nowadays you don't want that like prototypical X that was like the Calvin Johnsons, the Andre Johnsons, the Julio Joneses of the world that were just leading wide receiver ones. Now the NFL defensive meta has changed. You're playing a lot more zone coverage. Man coverage isn't as prevalent. The shorter throw there's more emphasis on the shorter throw in the NFL. And the guys, when you look at that are the wide receiver ones in fantasy football, it's these guys that have this duality to their game. They're able to get the free squares in the offense, move around the offense, get in the slot. And then they also come with like the high upside. Obviously they have the talent to create those short targets and turn them into touchdowns, and also still just get like the outside targets. Like CeeDee Lamb's probably one of the better players in terms of that regard. But even look at Jamar Chase, who was number 1 in points per game last year, had his highest slot rate in the NFL last season, coming off the absence of Tyler Boyd, guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, like the past couple years, like these are archetypes that if you go to a decade ago, you'd be like, that guy's not that exciting. But in today's NFL, those are the guys now that are scoring the most points in fantasy football. And when the Jaguars lost Christian Kirk, they lost Evan Ingram, they lost Gabe Davis down the stretch, it forced them to say like, hey, we have to get more creative with Brian Thomas Jr. He actually ran more routes in the slot last year than Nabors did his rookie season, who was road blocking him in LSU in terms of those slot snaps. And, when he got access to those targets, he averaged over 3 yards per out run from the slot. And that was the unlocking point. So I do believe with them also bringing over Liam Cohen, like you definitely have some excitement here. hear, Liam Cohen, you'll hear a lot of like, is he going to be in the Chris Godwin role or the Mike Evans role? But he's really just me in the Brian Thomas Jr. role because he can do both things. Like he can do both things. So I definitely believe that that's excitement. Like you said, is the price tag like kind of at the cusp of like, we talked about Jaden Daniels. To me, it makes sense. Are you super like intoxicated to like draft him? Like when you're like, oh, I can just get Amon-Ra St. Brown a little bit cheaper and like know what I have from a multi-year sample. I get it. But to me, it makes sense though that his ADP is in this area because he's going to get just a truckload in terms of target share. He's going to be, it's going to be massive. They haven't added anyone.
That's what I was going to say. If you look at Amon-Ra, the one thing, even with how good his season was last year, the way that offense is structured, and I'm sure Gibbs is going to come more in here for targets. You have Sam Laporta, like there's Jameson Williams was a big factor as well. So it's spread around to a certain extent. Where there was games last year where like some of the options just went a little bit invisible, and then they had such commanding leads that sometimes you didn't need to force the ball to Amon-Ra. But yeah, your point again, and it kind of fitted in with the conversation because during the QBs, I mentioned the 0 RB targets, basically trying to find the different profiles. But when you're looking at this and the way the game has changed and thinking just about fantasy football, like, if you had, let's just say it's AJ Green out at the, out wide, and you're looking for him to win contested catches, 15 yards downfield. Whereas now you've Jamar Chase, and because it's zone coverage and the guys like, sometimes 8 yards off the line of scrimmage, it's just like Joe Burrow's catching the ball and just doing like a long handoff out to him. But that's getting you 1 PPR point. And then if he takes any yards after it, which he does quite a bit, and you're looking at that, the free squares element that you're mentioning is almost like that Konami code to the wide receiver position to add into it. So we get Brian Thomas. I think you have to draft him there at that point. You may have a preference of like Amon-Ra versus him, but for example, like I think we have to be classing him as a first round wide receiver. The next one is Malik Nabors. I think we're going to be in the same conversation here. Just a sensational performance. Like you look at the QB play. The QB play mightn't be any better this year, as long as we can avoid Russell Wilson probably. But if we can get Jameis Winston in there with Malik Nabors, he may have some record-setting seasons.
We were all hoping for that to kind of happen, the Jameis factor, because we saw what even Jerry Jeudy was able to do with Jameis. Jerry Jeudy also like a tough guy to like really kind of diagnose where to even handle him because of the split.
But also fits the category of not happening year one, like taking time for it to develop and the situation to evolve.
I'll be excited if we do get through this, because you did have like a question on the show sheet about like things we learned last year, and I definitely think that
we'll try and we'll get through these wide receivers and we'll squeeze it in now that you teased it.
Well, I mean, listen, the Giants at least understood the assignment with Malik Nabors, right? Like when he was on the field, he was targeted. He had 37% of the team targets on plays he was on the field. Like 37%. Like we know what we have here. I mean, he was targeted on 31% of his routes as a rookie. Only Puka Nacua was targeted at a higher rate per route run than he was. Like they understood the assignment. They still have basically the same wide receiver room as last year. And the quarterback play could be better. He actually also could have access to better downfield targets than we had last year with Russell Wilson. I mean, New York quarterbacks on deep throws last year, they were 24th in rating. They were 28th, and they only completed 26% of their deep targets. And Russell Wilson, as much as we want to bag on Russell Wilson, like he still can get the ball down the field effectively. Even on those deep throws last year at Pittsburgh, I mean, he was third in the NFL in rating. He was second in completion rate on those throws. Like that's still the Russ. What does Collinsworth call them? The moon balls?
I call them moon balls. Anyway, I think some of that we have to put some of that on Pickens and contested catches.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, we even had this.
Malik Nabors can do anything that Pickens can do, so we can.
That's my thoughts too. Is that Nabors we just might be able to get him? I said a couple more deep balls, as opposed to where he just had to win on these hand holding throws that Daniel Jones and the other thing we didn't talk about Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones is just how weird it is putting those two guys together because they play different games. Like one guy wants to push the ball to downfield, the other guy doesn't. It's just weird dynamic with what other Colts are trying this year. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, how are you going to fade a guy that's going to get 30 to 35% of the targets?
I don't think you can fade Nabors. Like you can have like Chase, Jefferson, Lamb above him, which is the way it is, but I feel like he's in that tier like already. I think he's going to be in that group for multiple years. And I do think that as much as I like Brian Thomas, like Nabors is a tier ahead of where he is, and there's only 2 picks between them. Just sensational overall profile. Next up here, we're going to go for Xavier Worthy. He was one of my most drafted players last year. Quite fortunate with the rookies that I did draft, Bucky Irvin, Brock Bowers, Jaden Daniels, Worthy. Worthy was probably like the one that was hardest to deal with throughout the season because just felt like plays were being left there, whether it was on him or whether it was on Mahomes. But now you also get Rashee Rice back in the situation post his injury. And it's interesting that they're going pretty much back-to-back as wide receiver 21 and 22. Interestingly, we didn't get to this with Patrick Mahomes, but people have kind of figured out that, the scoring profile for that Kansas City offense, now that the defense is so strong, they haven't been needing to put it up as much as they would have, let's say, with Tyreek Hill and a prime Travis Kelce. But he is going now as the wide receiver or the QB 6 in the 6th round. Both of those guys then are going off the board 2 rounds ahead of him. The question becomes then, can you support all of that together with Travis Kelce, who's going the pick before Patrick Mahomes? So they're still high up there in terms of the ADP. But Xavier Worthy entering year 2, did the Super Bowl kind of show us that maybe they were starting to get some things together? Him and Mahomes,
and Worthy in general was an interesting prospect because obviously he had the early breakout and then had the down, kind of end of the season. Now we've started to see like that just maybe a Quinn Ewers Texas wide receiver connection because the way the Texas guys are kind of Matthew Golden basically going to be projected for a 1st round pick. It's like, all right, so do we have just like a running theme here where just guys going to perform with Ewers or that offense couldn't use those guys effectively? But in Worthy again is another one of those guys that had that late push because he got access to kind of all these targets. In the front half of the year, the Chiefs were largely using him as you either get a screen pass or like we're just trying to connect on a deep.
He was the motion a lot of the time. Like he's the fake motion to try and open things up for the rest of the offense. A lot of the time as a rookie, and we've seen it too with Rice in his rookie season. He didn't get involved to post the bye week and then was more involved, but they really did start to use him in a lot of different ways. And we started to see him get, 10 target games towards the end of the season. He was getting 6 receptions. He was getting early targets involved in the game plan on those like first 15 plays. And it was very positive, but now you're dealing with also, technically, I think I would still say the wide receiver 1 and Rashee Rice coming in, but maybe we're seeing Travis Kelce get a little bit more phased out. So maybe it does become more of a game towards the wide receivers. And just when we're talking about it, maybe that does open things up again a little bit for Patrick Mahomes. So there's a lot of things that could change here with the Chiefs in 2025.
And I think we're all kind of also anticipating them to potentially add a receiving back in this class. That it definitely exists in the range of
when are they going to hit on a running back pick in the draft? When's that going to happen?
We don't know. Well, they did hit. To be fair, they did hit on Pacheco in terms of value, but
in terms of value, but
but he's in the final year of his rookie contract now this year, and like he obviously is coming off the injury, and but like it's fragile. He's another guy from a dynasty stance. Like I really don't know what to tell you what to do with him. Like he was another one of guys like when you're doing dynasty ranks, and you're just like, well, this feels okay for now, but it feels pretty fragile.
He feels like he's, in that Rashad White mold, once this draft happens, like the floor's falling out here.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's the one thing with Worthy though, is like, I think from a talent perspective, Worthy's probably good. And I want to take nibbles on him at that price, but it's just seeing how all the pieces fit together and who gets that role when everyone's healthy, right? Because Rice is more of that guy. Like Rice
like as a rookie, more rugged. When he was really breaking out as a rookie, there was a lot of like the around the line of scrimmage, the crossing routes, and that was what Worthy was doing stronger at the end of the season.
And that's what elevated him. That's what gave him that more consistency. It just added that consistency to his floor. Like I always talk about, like adding those free squares. Like it is relevant. It's absolutely relevant from a fantasy football stance.
What I would like to see them doing is like we have seen Rice work outside as well and across the middle, as I mentioned. And if they could get into a situation a bit like we were talking about there with like the evolving nature of the NFL where you can be outside now and work the slot. What I would like to see is like maneuvering those two guys as to they're almost like switching roles on certain plays. Yeah. So they're getting.
And they still have Hollywood.
Yeah.
And they still have Hollywood. Like they brought him back too. So it's like, I mean, the Chiefs definitely are stocked again in terms of talent. And we haven't just really seen the sample of these guys playing together, which is I think why you're seeing them kind of go back to back. And then you have the Rashee Rice off the field stuff that like, will we see something happen? Won't we? Who knows? Yeah. I will say if at ADP, I'm more interested in Rice just because I think like the archetype of player he is comes a little more insulation. Like I think he does do a little bit more on his own, but
I would agree with that too.
I think I still would want both these guys at this price point. I think both guys are probably underpriced in a sense of where we can get. I prefer Rice in a vacuum, but I also still see the opportunity where I'm looking at Worthy's price and I'm looking at some of the guys he's priced around. I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense where I would still, take nibbles and take shots on him versus some of these other guys.
I agree with that. The next one's going to be interesting. It's Marvin Harrison. Obviously came in.
The opposite of everything we talked about so far. 0 free squares, went to a coaching team that had no idea what to do with him. And some of this was in his profile in college, and that's what made him versus Nabors kind of a tough thing to evaluate. It was like, wow, Nabors is entering the NFL at an exact time where it's perfect for his skill set. Where if Marv would have came in a year or 8 years ago, it would have been for him.
Yeah, a throwback in terms of how they used him. I have a lot of concerns around Kyler as a quarterback,
Yes.
and I think the fit is not great between to be nice about it, not great between the two of them. But he is going right in that range. He's the wide receiver 18. Between him and the two KC receivers, you get Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, so two of the veterans. You're getting him at a reasonable price in the 4th round. I would much rather have him over Evans or Adams, I believe, but I would rather have either of the Kansas City wide receivers over Harrison. I feel like the price is fair though, but he fits into that category for me. If he was, 5 to 10 picks below ADP is where I kind of would be willing to take him. Are we though? Is that me overreacting too much? You had an interesting point there about the profile, and if he was here a decade ago, would be much more interesting. Is that just something that could be a detriment to his whole career, or is that on the Cardinals for not putting him into some of those situations to pick up those free squares?
And that's the toughest thing to diagnose, right? So like right now we still have to kind of operate as potentially both, but we also don't want to just make excuses for him because we did this with Kyle Pitts, right?
We did.
Like, it's like, hey, so it's like, hey, man, like what? Sometimes a player is who he showed, but sometimes it isn't, and we'll get into that probably a little later too. Because like the pro side for Harrison's, like he didn't have as bad as a season. It was just in context of expectations. It was bad because you look at it like since 2000.
He also had the trouble of when you like have two players who it's like, who is the wide receiver one in this rookie class? Is it Harrison or Nabors? And then like Nabors absolutely blew him out of the water.
Correct. Yeah. And he got absolutely eviscerated basically by everyone in his ADP, where he was priced at. Also, but like in context of the rookie draft stuff, it was, so it was all bad. Now you get the discount a little bit, but you can make the pro argument and say, like, he actually did things as a rookie that were good. I mean, since 2000, the only guys to have over 850 yards and 8 touchdowns and fewer than 65 catches are Julio Jones, AJ Brown, Chase Claypool, and Tampa Bay Mike Williams. And again, like that's the archetype of player we might be dealing with. Like, Marv was a guy who didn't break a lot of tackles at Ohio State. He wasn't asked to do these things either, so we didn't know if it was in his game. And he lined up outside and basically was a prototypical X, and that's how Drew Petzing used him last year. I mean, you look at last year, he had not one target at or behind the line of scrimmage. He was that
feels like a a duty of care issue there. That seems like at some point at least show it on film that you're going to try it.
Yeah, just not even one. 26% of his targets came on go routes. It was the second highest rate among receivers with 50 or more targets on the year. The only other guy that had a higher rate was Keon Coleman. When Marv was able to work over the middle of the field and run crossing routes, and he averaged over 2.1 yards per out run on crossing routes. So it's interesting if you go back to the Cardinal season, there was the Miami game where he broke out.
Yeah.
And they asked Kyler Murray, well, he had like the huge game against the Rams, but it was on like plays that weren't sustainable. Like you saw those plays and you're like, those are just plays that don't happen all the time. Where like there was a breakdown in coverage and like he got loose in a scramble drill and then had the long touchdown. But the Miami game was where he looked like a legitimate wide receiver one. And after that game, they talked to Kyler Murray about it. And he was like, yeah, during the week, we got together and we talked about some of the things that he wanted to do that he wasn't doing in the offense. They incorporated that. And they never did that again the rest of the year. Like, they just like, well, what was the whole point? Like, they never incorporated it in the offense the rest of the season. And it was just super weird, his usage. So we're kind of flying blind because we have Drew Petzing again. He's in the same system. Like, how are we expected to just flip? Right.
And the other thing that I think is detrimental to him is like, we're talking about the two Kansas City wide receivers and people will be like, well, they're competition, so they're going to cannibalize each other. But Marvin Harrison is the wide receiver 2 on this team after Trey McBride. Like Trey McBride's, yeah. So I think like you can't just be like, well, Marvin Harrison. Some people might think it's a safe play because he's going to get the work because the other wide receivers aren't as good, but the tight end talent is obviously extreme. I feel like, though, in this point, when you're in the 4th round, I said about the picks after ADP, but if you look at what he did last year, it is like, that's a value in the 4th round. And if he can take a step forward, then it becomes...
I think especially from like a best ball stance, he
Yeah.
becomes more appealing than me than a redraft stance. I think the ADP I think is fine overall, but like we know he can still be a touchdown scorer, and I think for best ball purposes, like that just holds weight, right? Like that holds weight. Like if you're able to score touchdowns, that's something where we don't have to play the game either. Like from a redraft stance, like because if you take Marvin Harrison even at his ADP this year, like where you did last year, you're still drafting at a point where you're just like, you can't like really bench this dude. Like you're just gonna take for what's better or worse and just hope it works out. That's why I said from a best ball stance, like he still fits that archetype where like I don't care if he gives me another 10 games where he has fewer than 50 yards. Like just give me 8 to 10 touchdowns, and I know that you'll get in my lineup those weeks. Whereas you might have a stretch for like a fantasy football stance where you're like, all right, he just had 3 games. I'm going to bench him now because I like my matchup of my wide receiver 5. And then you miss the 2 touchdown game he has. And that's stuff infuriating as like a gamer stance. And that's where I think from a redraft stance, it might turn me off a little bit for him. Like where I look at him in ADP and I'm like, ooh, I can maybe just get Jameson Williams and play that same song and dance at a little bit cheaper, like, or do something like that. So maybe from a redraft stance, I'm a little more hesitant, but from a best ball stance, I think his ADP is pretty attractive.
You mentioned Jameson Williams. A nice segue here because the player that's going 1 pick before him is Rome Odunze, going as the wide receiver 25. And I'm going to tee this. We talked about his quarterback, and he fits me for it's certainly a fade, if not maybe just off the board at his ADP. But what are you expecting here from Odunze in his second year? Was certainly disappointing in his rookie campaign.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking for, Ben Johnson, you're kind of placing that faith in Ben Johnson, be able to kind of create, again, to stay on the theme with this like whole context of the show is giving access to Rome Odunze to targets that just weren't available to him as a rookie year. I mean, he averaged 13.8 air yards per target. Calvin Ridley was the only receiver to have a higher ADOT with as many targets as Odunze had. 23% of his targets came on throws 20 or more yards downfield. The only receivers with as many targets and a higher rate were, again, Ridley, DK Metcalf, and George Pickens. Those are not guys when you look at the player he is and say like that shouldn't be how he's used. And then when you play that with the types of targets he was getting paired with the struggles that Caleb Williams had, 26.7% of his targets last year were inaccurate throws by the quarterback. That was the highest rate for any player at that many targets. Yeah, it's no player had a higher rate. Adonai Mitchell had a higher rate, but not as many targets. And so you say like, all right, now
who was Mitchell's quarterback again?
Yeah. Yep. And so you're saying with Keenan Allen removed from the fold here in terms of like a target potential of him getting those types of targets, and then the Ben Johnson factor, because Ben Johnson Jameson Williams did have some deep targets last where he caught long balls, but how many what really was great for Jameson Williams, especially the back half of the year, is you saw some of the consistency for him because he was actually getting shorter targets too.
Yeah.
And so you're looking just for Ben Johnson to unlock that aspect of Rome Odunze's target tree that he just didn't have access to as a rookie.
And do you think that's likely?
I do believe so. I think when you pair that with the loss of Keenan Allen, I do believe in it. I do think the price is, I think he's fine where he is. Like, I don't think he's like a home run. I probably will draft. He's a guy like that whole bucket of guys where I'm looking at ADP. I'm willing to just like, I think those guys are gonna be scattershot just based on, how my draft is, who's available. Like when you're talking about like the Jameson Williams, the Zay Flowers of the world, like those guys. Yeah, Devontae Smith. Like those are all guys where it's kind of be like, who's here? Like, those types of situations. But I think those guys are all fine.
I think, I would agree. They're all fine. He's probably the end of that tier for me, but my concern would be if the quarterback doesn't take the step forward and the accuracy issues continue. But I think it's a fine spot. I'll go a step further. I'll take him 10 picks below ADP. We move in then to somebody who I'm going to jump to that didn't, in my opinion, deliver. And there was other options. Like we talked on the last show with Bryce Young and the kind of recovery of his, I guess, career based on how the start of that season went. But you have him linking up with like Adam Thielen, making him look like, an all-pro as the season went on. Xavier Legette did get drafted. People may forget in the first round last year. May have been an overdraft, I do believe, by the team. But what's your thoughts on him entering year 2? Is he somebody we should not be giving up on this soon, or is he somebody that you're out on?
He's a guy I'll draft just based on like I will take shots on year 2 wide receivers again, just to see kind of I'll buckshot a lot of these guys and just see what sticks.
See what
I
comes
will
up.
say from a case by case stance, I'd be very concerned because I do also believe he was overdrafted, right? And when you have a player like this that had struggles in his profile as a rookie that he had in college, because he was very much a project, coming out of South Carolina, and his best stretch came again when Adam Thielen was out and he got a little more access to some of those freer squares.
Yeah.
And we know Thielen's back. Do they add another receiver? Do they take a Tet McMillan early? We'll see. I mean, he was basically outperformed by Jalen Coker. Jalen Coker
He's
had
going
19
six wide receiver slots after them. So
he had 20 fewer receiving yards than Legette and ran 140 fewer routes. So I do think that my concern with Legette is that he ended up overdraft. He was just an overdrafted player, and so the draft capital still kind of floating is carrying him. But I have definitely concerns about where he is. I'll probably draft him on principle just to take some shots to see if he just sticks, right? But I definitely had concerns with his prospect that weren't alleviated.
Yeah, he's wide receiver 66. So if you are looking into second-year players,
very low risk.
Yeah, but you mentioned Coker as well. He's wide receiver 69. So you're kind of on the clock. You're deciding between those two. I probably lean towards the Coker side. But yeah, I still think you want to, like you mentioned, have some exposure to these second-year players, because you want to have that humility when you're in the draft that you may just be wrong. The team may see it slightly different. The usage may become different. And if he's somebody who starts to get some of those free square targets, when he's wide receiver 66, it mightn't be the most, thrilling campaign, but he might finish as a top 36 wide receiver, and it's quite
and on the field last year, as bad as everything was for Legette on the field last year, when he was on the field, he did leave the team in end zone targets. So that's something that he still could potentially still do in year 2 as well. So again, especially in these best ball leagues where you just run into the weeks he scores touchdowns, and that's useful.
The next player we're going to jump to missed the start of the season because of off-season issues.
Probably the most interesting of all the guys.
You think so? Well, I'll hype him up here. Just the way the season started, the way the season progressed. They had last offseason, you have the situation where Ayuk's looking for the contract, signs with the team. Team seems to want to move on. You get Deebo Samuel as part of the offense. Now they've moved on from him. But in those last 2 weeks in particular, we start to see him be added in more. And the player I'm talking about is Ricky Pearsall. Some huge weeks in those last 2 weeks. Like they're real standout. How much emphasis are we, going those 2 weeks in the sample size and wheels up here? We're ready to go on Pearsall as we move forward, based on, also it looks quite positive for the players who have moved on from this offense and may move on. He's wide receiver 41, but going in the 8th round. So I feel like he's a player where if you're not looking into like those last 2 weeks of the season, let's say your team stank last year and your season was over, you're like, week 14, I'm out, I'm checking out here, and then you come into your draft room and you're like, Ricky Pearsall's in the 8th round, what's happening here? So tell me the case here. Where are you on him?
Well, I just think the overall conversation around Ricky Pearsall, even not the player, is probably what makes this the most interesting of all the guys we talked about. Because as of right now, Brandon Ayuk is still on the roster, and we're expecting him to be on the roster, at the start of the season. And although Ayuk's coming off of the ACL, surgery, he'll be at 10 months removed when the season kicks off. He had a surgery November 11th, so it'll be right around 10 weeks. But even if they bring him along slowly, what happens when Ayuk plays? Who is squeezed out? Because historically, this is not a 3 wide receiver offense.
No, and you also have Juwan Jennings.
And that's what I was going to say. You still have Juwan Jennings. And when Juwan Jennings played last year at any point, he was awesome.
He was the man.
And you brought up the 2 games where Pearsall went off. Well, one of those, Juwan Jennings got kicked out of for a fight. Got ejected in. So that was also influenced part of the factor to how much do we stock that? Because Jennings was a guy that he filled in for Ayuk, he filled in for Samuel, and then he obviously had his initial role at the start of the season, which was that slot 3rd wide receiver spot that came in when they did play 11 personnel on the limited snaps that they did. So the Ayuk coming back factor, whenever that happens, because this might be a situation where you do take Pearsall in the 8th round and he looks like a value the opening month of the season. And then what if he's the guy that's squeezed And then you don't have that end of the season value from him, whereas the opposite of last year, because that exists also in the range of outcomes. And what if it's Jennings, right? What if it's not? So like that's what makes this whole dynamic with the 49ers very interesting, is the fact that, the Brandon Ayuk being on the roster and like what happens to this offense when everyone is healthy. And then you also have CMC potentially coming back too, because CMC didn't play last year. He appeared in 4 games last year. He actually played the fewest snaps of his career on offense. So the 49ers in general are just an offense where we talk a little bit about the Chiefs. Like, how does this all fit together when everyone's playing? We do have that element in play with the 49ers. I do think at this price point, though, like you just say you dabble, you at least dabble. Like he can't be a guy you fade, I don't think, just because of the upside of this offense. But
the other part with it is he like, again, he was a 31st pick of the first round last year. And again, it doesn't really feel like that was the case, when you're thinking first round picks and how you're looking going into year 2. But it was just a unique situation. And you mentioned the players on the 49ers. We didn't mention George Kittle, who without Deebo Samuel is usually the linchpin of this offense. So, it's going to be hard to get those targets. But Ayuk's wide receiver 45, wide receiver 41 is Pearsall, and then wide receiver 36 is Juwan Jennings. They're all going one round apart,
right,
so
kind of near each other. Yeah.
So you have to kind of make your bets there. So it's going to be quite intriguing. I would find that based on how the team is evolved, obviously you go in the talent and how the player is performing. But with the injury to Ayuk, I feel like he could be the one that's squeezed out, because I feel like the team, once that right in that contract, regretted the deal, and I think they'll be looking at ways, even maybe during the season, if they're not in contention, to potentially move on from Ayuk. But we'll see what happens there. But
they're in a tough spot. Obviously, we've seen them, what they've had to do to kind of calibrate the potential extension for Brock Purdy this offseason, and losing, contributors on both sides of the ball. They also have, guys upcoming. Kittle's contract expires this offseason. Jennings also expires.
They're
after
really
this
up
season.
against it.
Yeah, they're really really punished here in terms of upcoming contracts too, who they're going to be able to retain. From a dynasty stance, Pearsall looks very, very safe, though, I would say, in that regard, because they're not going to be able to keep all these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So, and it feels like we talked about like things getting out of the box and being able to unwrap them and see what they are. Ricky Pearsall at the moment, there's all those questions around it, but we could be looking entering the 2026 draft season as him as like a top 4 rounds of ADP. If it's a case that he performs and Ayuk's out, and then potentially Jennings could be out as well. There's a lot of ways it can play it, but I think he's somebody to keep a close eye on this draft season. Keon Coleman didn't really do a huge amount for the Bills. What are we doing with Coleman?
Again, this is a guy that I think, just like Legette, is that everything I saw from him as a rookie was what I was worried about in his collegiate profile. And so it's hard for me to really get on board again at cost, especially attached to Josh Allen. Like he won't be a guy I absolutely have zero of, but that also exists, like where I just say like, yeah, this is kind of where I thought it was going to be for him. Not a player that had a lot of versatility to his game coming out of college. That obviously didn't happen in the Joe Brady offense. And these guys in the Joe Brady, going back to 2 years now, like he loves to rotate these outside receivers, man. Because everyone thought even Amari Cooper was going to get this big value bump going to the Bills from the Browns last year, and he just got kind of caught in that rotation of like, dude, they play all these guys around Khalil Shakir. They're rotating these guys in for different.
And there's obviously a big part of the offense too being Josh Allen and the running game, and wanting people who are like, sometimes you're out there blocking on these plays. You're not actually like running routes, so it's not optimal. Like I think they might want to use him in that direction more so than as a receiver. But he is going as the wide receiver 56. So he's not expensive. Again. But it's one of those, like, I'm going to take some of it in case. But I think, again, we know the way the Bills want to operate this offense, and it really is true Josh Allen and true the running backs here moving forward. The last player that's on the list, and might have saved the best to last, I'll be interested in what you think. Lad McConkey, wide receiver 11. So out of last year's class, 3 of those guys going in the top 2 rounds. Again, came on strong, showed a lot. He gets a lot of those kind of free square plays that we're talking about.
Oh, baby, yeah, he does.
I think that's the reason why he's here, and that's for him. It's priced in as like getting those plays to bump up the scoring. But does he have the upside to get himself into that, Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown kind of tier?
He definitely fits like that profile of young Amon-Ra, right? Because like Amon-Ra early on got those free squares, and then he got the dual usage, like the cup usage is what we talk about, like that.
Yeah.
That is getting the free squares plus can win outside, and that's the thing in Ladd McConkey's profile that you're excited about, is that he still was the wide receiver 9 in yards per out run outside of the slot as well. And
And
that
I
was
wasn't expecting that to be. I didn't really fully believe that development would happen in the NFL with him.
And he had that in his collegiate profile too. It's
Yeah.
just that he had such a weird sample size in college that it was just kind of like, all right, what's real, what's not. And he did get those free squares like you talked about. I mean, he led all wide receivers in yards off play action. He was number 2 in yards off the slot. Because again, these are all cheat codes for wide receivers, like pre-snap motion, play action style. Like these are all things that are just like, they're the Konami code stuff that we talked about that are like, they're micro edges that aren't fully priced into some players. It is obviously in this one. And then you had the trust from Greg Roman as the season progressed in this passing offense. From week 8 on, the Chargers only threw the ball 1% over expectations, but that was actually pretty significant. Like
They like to run.
That was actually pretty significant because prior to that point, they were 5% below pass rate expectations. They were 20th in drop back rate. They were 29th in pass rate from overall. From that point on, we talked about Justin Herbert was able to get himself back into like the lower end QB1 expectations. The team was able to generate more splash plays. And what that did was unlock Ladd McConkey as a fantasy asset. The final 10 games here, he was wide receiver 5 in yards per game. He doubled his yards per game from 44 yards per game to 88 yards per game. The fewest yards he had in a game over that stretch was 52 yards, which again, high floor player, then gets paired with the ceiling potential. And that's why you see him moving. They only added Mike Williams so far this offseason. We expect them maybe to add another guy. I think the one thing you maybe could talk yourself into potentially getting concerned with Ladd McConkey versus guys at his ADP is just like, is he the guy that like runs into like a crappy touchdown outcome? But that's very, very picking hairs. Because again, I think he's very much on that like Amon-Ra spectrum.
Yeah, the part with him that you would like to see where the growth is. We're talking about the free squares, but if the team is able to control the ball and not be behind, I do think offensively they probably want to limit the amount of times they're passing in a game. So if we look at the overall targets on the area is the 112, but there's only the 2 double-digit games. One of them 2 weeks from the end of the season gets 10 targets. 5 weeks from the end of the season gets 12 targets. He does get 14 targets in the loss. In those games where they have to put up some points. Now, against the Patriots, I guess they didn't have to put up any points. They win 40-7. He gets 10 targets. But in those situations, like if most of his games last year are 6 or 7 target games. But if we start to get him into the 9-10 targets and they're those free square targets, you start to really ramp up the overall points. So it's Ladd McConkey is very exciting as we move into this season. We were going to finish it up there, but you mentioned about wanting to answer one of these bonus questions that I had on the show sheet. So what is the biggest lesson that you learned? And Ivan, in 2024, you could do this. We're talking on the first show this week, we talked about like things from 2013. So what is the biggest lesson you've learned in recent seasons, and how will it influence your 2025 season?
Yeah, and definitely, and not just in a vacuum. I think big picture. So like I talked about a little bit, like fantasy analysts, they love to say like, or fantasy gamers, they're paying for something that they've already seen, right? That gets priced in. You might have some rookie stuff, like when JT's can have a high, ADP, right? Like when he comes into the NFL, like we saw like Marv, but like
the other that was one of the things I meant to, sorry to interrupt. We're talking about wanting to see the things open, but because there's more and more content, people are starting to realize like rookies are an edge. So that's one of the things that I would say, since like you touched on the Konami code stuff in 2013, a lot of those edges that we had like 10 years ago, they aren't as big of an edge, but there's ways that like nuances to find them. So the Konami quarterbacks, people are like copped on at this point that the Russian upside is beneficial.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like the profiles of some of the 0 RB players, but particularly the rookies in year 1. It used to be like all double-digit round picks. Now they're like up in round 4, round 2 for Genty, for example. But yeah, sorry for interrupting. Jump back to
no. Well, the inverse of that too is that fantasy gamers and fantasy analysts, like I said, I've been guilty of this too, is saying what a player has done to this point is all he can be too. And they're saying, because again, fantasy football is not like we use a lot of old data, like things that have already transpired for fantasy. A lot of things that are just more descriptive of what happened than they're necessarily predictive for fantasy football.
Yeah.
It's a game that's consistently ever evolving. So the last couple of years, I've been a lot more open, for players in that regard that are being discounted because people just kind of believe that's who they are and that their body of work just can't evolve when, kind of placed in new conditions. Like we saw, like, a guy like Evan Ingram, turn his career around like that. But like last year, definitely, there were a lot of nebulous situations that weren't priced in appropriately. You brought up George Kittle. George Kittle ended up, being arguably the second best value at the tight end position outside of Brock Bowers.
He was egregiously priced last year. And
yes.
He's in last year. The big debate became about elite tight end in the offseason. Like, what is an elite tight end? Does it work? Should you draft them? On and on and on. It got to the point last year where I was talking a lot about double elite tight end for best ball. You want to get 2 of those guys in the top 9 picks, and Brock Bowers then was the end of the tier. But like, Brock Bowers was an absolute steal. We know how the season went, but like, tight end 7 a lot of the time was George Kittle, which just felt like, what are we doing here?
Well, then Kittle ran into that period where the 49ers just never had everyone on the field together. So it never impacted what, through Kittle's career had been like a bugaboo, right? Like he kind of, when everyone was always available, Kittle was kind of always found himself in like kind of that odd man out, but he never was the odd man out because they never had anyone all together. And no one really kind of priced that in, even in the 11th hour when we knew like we had the potential Ayuk could either be traded or could hold out. And then we had the preseason injury to Ricky Pearsall, and then we had the preseason injury to Christian McCaffrey, which of course no one knew how to appropriately handle because the 49ers didn't tell us until Monday night.
Didn't tell us.
But then not even George Kittle, but how about another thing? Like, how about T. Higgins, right? There was this whole notion of what T. Higgins was over to this point of his career, but no one priced in Tyler Boyd leaving the Bengals and then unlocking T. Higgins to get access to those types of targets that we talked about. T. Higgins had his highest career rate of throws under 10 yards the line of scrimmage of his career and doubled it by over 10%, or exceeded it by 10%, not doubled it, exceeded it by over 10%. Because Andre Yoshvash and Jermaine Burton, neither one of those guys stepped into that role. No one was ever pricing that in, though, with T. Higgins. We had Terry McLaurin getting, Jaden Daniels and Cliff. And then in the 11th hour, we had the Jahan Dotson trade. Cortland Sutton, another one of these guys that said, this is all Cortland Sutton is this contested catch guy. You know what? Cortland Sutton became a high floor player last year.
Yep. And I was completely out on Sutton. And your point on Terry McLaurin is very good because he was another player I was like, he might get a little bump with the new quarterback, but seeing what he did to now the point that like we're looking at him in the 3rd round, like that was, I guess it's a good point. I kind of fell guilty to that as much as I liked Jaden Daniels coming in to be his quarterback.
Yeah, and you brought up Judy. People were out on Judy. And then, so if you want to apply some of that stuff like as it is right now, because we didn't have a great free agent class, so like we didn't have like a lot of moving pieces, but we do have kind of like we talked about a little bit with Nabors, like how much of a bump does he get with Russell? What if it's better than people think? Because again, people just think Russell Wilson is this, but what if it is a significant upgrade? What kind of ceiling could have? We have, we talked about Liam Cohen going to the Jaguars, obviously all the whole Bears situation, and people are pricing in obviously a lot of the Ben Johnson stuff, but you also have Keenan Allen leaving. Does that help a guy like Cole Kmet? Does Cole Kmet become in that value range of tight ends now? Because he could be the guy that could have a larger bump with Keenan Allen leaving. We have Geno Smith, joining the Raiders. We don't know like what we're going to get from Tanner Enstrand, going to the Jets. We just don't know a lot about him. Christian Kirk is a player. A lot of people think Christian Kirk is what Christian Kirk is, but what if Christian Kirk actually does get kind of like this access to be like a Tank Dell role in an offense with CJ Stroud? We didn't really talk about that with CJ Stroud, but like Christian Kirk is just kind of hanging out in ADP. Like there's definitely an outcome where he could be a lot better than people are thinking. I don't know what we're going to do with the Dallas running backs. We have to kind of wait till after the draft, but there's all these other situations where you can kind of play. It's like there's stuff that's ever evolving in the NFL, and definitely want to incorporate that into your game outside of just saying like, this is a guy's target share. Like think about like how guys are going to be used and how things could be unlocked. We saw this with Darnell Mooney, right? Last year too. Like Darnell Mooney was a guy that people were like, Darnell Mooney's just Darnell Mooney. And then, ends up being one of the better value picks too at his spot because of the situation changed for him. So definitely keep an open mind to those things. Guys like Joe Mixon, obviously Saquon's the big one, right? Like, You know, the big, but he's the front. Well, Chris Godwin too, just getting Liam Cohen, because Chris Godwin was used in a different capacity than he was used up in that point of score. We were gonna get it with Rashid Shaheed. Damn it, we were robbed. We were robbed of the Rashid Shaheed season. I'll always forever cry a tear for that. Oh my god.
He got off to a hot start. So did Chris Godwin, who you mentioned there as well. But yeah, I do think, like I just, I'll say when I'm in drafts, I try and have that kind of mindset of like, you don't know everything and trying to be humble as you make those selections. But there is times where I will be.
The two Steelers receivers are probably the biggest guys we might be guilty of, right? Because we're not even just factoring DK Metcalf and George Pickens being kind of similar guys. We also have the quarterback thing that's not resolved. And then you have the Arthur Smith thing, which no one else has
Nobody wants resolved.
But I mean, again, like, especially in your best ball leagues, like we know that DK Metcalf and George Pickens are still going to put crooked games up.
I'm willing to say that I'm out on the Steelers offense, but I think that is I think that is more
we'll have Calvin Ridley
Arthur Smith
too
side of things than anything.
Where's Calvin Ridley going in these drafts? Like wide receiver 40, and we don't really know.
Wide receiver
like,
42, yeah.
And we don't really know what kind of bump he's going to get with Cam Ward, but we do know like all the target share stuff was lined up. If it's just better quarterback play, like I would say he probably clears wide receiver 40 pretty easily. It's just what kind of ceiling do you get with it? But
it's going to be interesting. That's why I can't wait for the draft to know where all the landing spots go along with it as well. But we have a lot of names. But I think, again, that's why I like that question, because it piques my interest as well. And like Terry McLaurin really was one that I wasn't drafting a huge amount of last year. And McLaurin has, since he came into the league, has been one of the guys I've always like had a kind of soft spot for from his early rookie days. But yeah, lots to think about and work through there. Hopefully people have enjoyed listening to our wide receiver discussion. We did talk quarterbacks earlier this week as well, working through the second and third year players and who you should be targeting in drafts this year. As we get ready to finish up, Rich, sharp football analysis, hit the listeners one more time with what they should be checking out here pre-NFL draft.
You got it. Sharpfootballanalysis.com. That's where I'll be creating kind of, my living, breathing draft kit over the rest of the summer. I do post a lot of free content as well. Usually there's a free article in every single individual series I do. And then we talk about the team needs and the team roster stuff where I'm going through every offensive roster. Those are all free on the site too. So you can check all those out.
And you can see, I did see on your Twitter or your X profile, you had all those linked as well. So if you want to find them really, really quick, go to @LordReeves on Twitter. You'll be able to scroll down, pick out which team you're looking to read up about there. But that is where we're going to close it out. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials @Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.